Weapons Officer Krell was a different creature than young Bren entirely. Where Bren was fresh-scaled and earnest, Krell was weathered, a veteran with 30 years of his own, with scars that tracked across his snout in pale lines where scales had grown back wrong after old injuries, with eyes that had a particular quality of something that has seen enough to know what it does not know. He had served under 4 different commanders. He had watched the Krell Dominion expand across 17 star systems through a combination of genuine military brilliance and the ruthless application of force. He hesitated. It was a small hesitation, barely a pause, the kind of thing that might be invisible on a bridge full of officers who were not watching for it. But Vexus noticed, and the expression on the commander's face sharpened. "If I may, sir," Krell said carefully, his claws resting on his console rather than moving across it. "There are stories about humans, about what happens when you push them too far, about their capacity for what?" Vexus's voice cracked with impatient amusement. Crying? Bleeding? Filing strongly worded diplomatic protests through the appropriate interstellar channels? That is a hospital ship, Krell. It is unarmed. It is unescorted. It is, and I want you to appreciate this fully, the single most obviously defenseless target we are ever likely to encounter in our entire military careers. He spread his arms wide, encompassing the viewport and the gleaming vessel beyond it. What precisely is it you imagine we need to be afraid of? Krell's claws hovered over his console, but did not descend. Perhaps a warning hail would be appropriate, sir. Standard protocol. "We will give them a warning," Vexus said, and his voice dropped into something smooth and almost gentle, the vocal equivalent of a predator settling into perfect stillness before the strike. "We will give them a warning shot across their bow. Something theatrical. And when they realize the nature of their situation, when they start transmitting in that desperate, plaintive way that humans do when they have finally understood that their optimism has carried them somewhere dangerous, we will board them. We will take what is useful. And we will claim it was a military vessel operating under medical cover. Fog of war. Identification error. These things happen." He settled back into his throne with the ease of a creature entirely comfortable with the decisions it was making. "Fire when ready, Krell. Let us see how quickly human principles evaporate under practical pressure." The bridge fell silent except for the deep, subsonic hum of charging plasma banks. On the viewport, the massive white hospital ship continued its slow, deliberate trajectory, serene, unhurried, radiating the particular piece of a thing that does not know it is being watched. How perfect, Vexus thought. How magnificently, tragically perfect. He was, as he would later reflect during the long, quiet years that followed, spectacularly wrong. The first plasma bolt screamed across the void, a brilliant, superheated lance of energy that carved a glowing line through the darkness and passed within 300 meters of the hospital ship's bow. At that range, aboard any competent vessel with functioning sensors, it was impossible to miss. Alarms would be screaming. Emergency protocols would be engaging. The crew would be scrambling for battle stations, for emergency broadcasting equipment, for the communication channels through which they would pour their desperate pleas. Nothing happened. The white vessel continued its trajectory without the slightest deviation. No course adjustment. No deceleration. No emergency broadcast on any frequency. No hailing signal. Not so much as a single automated distress beacon activated. The hospital ship moved through space with the unhurried composure of a thing that had been informed of the plasma bolt and had decided, after careful consideration, that it did not merit a response. "HM," Vexus said, leaning forward in his throne with the first faint stirring of something that was not quite discomfort, but was perhaps its very distant cousin. "So," Communications Officer Thixel, a female Krell with exceptional hearing ridges who had served under Vexus for 6 years, looked up from her console. No incoming transmission. No distress signal. No automated emergency response. Nothing across any monitored frequency. "Possibly they did not detect it," offered Bren, his voice carrying a particular tone of someone trying very hard to believe their own suggestion. Vexus's laugh was sharp. "They detected it. They are frozen with fear, Bren. Paralyzed. I have seen it before in lesser species, the moment when reality outpaces preparation and the target simply stops. It is a stillness before the collapse." He gestured forward. "Krell, another shot. Closer this time. Give them something undeniable." The second plasma bolt fired with the deep, resonant percussion of the Talon's main batteries, and this time it skimmed within 50 meters of the hospital ship's hull, close enough that even minimal shielding, if it existed, would have flickered to life in automatic response. Close enough that any competent crew would already be screaming into every available channel. Still nothing. So, Vexus's voice had taken on a quality that Vexus did not immediately recognize, because he had not heard it from her before. It was uncertainty, not the ordinary uncertainty of incomplete data, but something deeper. Still no response. No hails. No distress signals. No shield activation. The vessel has not altered course, has not acknowledged our presence in any way. She paused. It is as though no one aboard is reacting at all. Then they have already surrendered in their hearts, Vexus declared, standing again with the restless energy of a predator who has been patient long enough. Krell, stop playing games. Target their engine section. Disable them completely, and we will board at our leisure. I want to look these humans in the eye when they realize that their precious protections are worth precisely nothing out here in the real galaxy. So, Krell began, and there was something in his voice, old, weighted, the sound of experience trying to speak before it is too late. I would strongly recommend. Fire. 3 plasma bolts struck the hospital ship's rear section in rapid succession, impacting directly where the engine compartment should have been. The blast bloomed across the white hull like terrible flowers, scorching the pristine paintwork, sending fractured hull plating spinning into the deck, creating the kind of obvious, undeniable damage that left no room for interpretation. The bridge crew erupted. Bran was clapping his claws together. Vexus allowed herself a small, tight smile. Even Krell released a breath that might have been relief, the relief of a man who feared he had been wrong about his phase. You see? Vexus turned to address his crew with the magnanimity of a commander who has just proven a point. Humans talk an impressive strategic game, but when it actually comes down to the fundamental transaction of combat, when the weapons fire and the hull plates buckle, they fold. That ship is dead in space. He turned back to the viewport with satisfaction settling across his features. Now, Krell, give me the finishing. He stopped. Something was wrong with what he was seeing. The hospital ship was not tumbling. Ships with destroyed engine sections tumbled. The physics of it were unavoidable, the loss of thrust creating rotational momentum that no maneuvering system could fully compensate. The Talon's plasma bolts had struck with enough force to gut a warship's propulsion array entirely, and yet the vessel ahead of them was stable. Perfectly, impossibly stable. Not venting atmosphere, not flickering its running lights in the erratic pattern of failing power distribution, moving, if anything, with exactly the same deliberate certainty it had maintained since they first detected it. Bran. Vexus's voice had changed. The satisfaction was gone, replaced by something careful and quiet. Sensor reading on that vessel. Full analysis. Bran was already staring at his console with an expression that had moved well past uncertainty into something that Vexus, in his long experience, recognized as the earliest stage of genuine fear. So, the young officer said slowly, the energy readings from that vessel have spiked. Significantly. He looked up, scales a shade paler than was normal even for someone of his age. So, we are talking about a 200% increase in power output, and it is not coming from their engine section. Then where is it coming from? That was when the alarms began. Not the routine klaxons of the Talon's damage control systems, which had been sounding softly since they opened fire. These were different. A specific frequency, a specific pattern that Vexus had heard precisely twice in his entire career, both times in situations that had resulted in him surviving only because of circumstances so fortunate they bordered on miraculous. The sound cut through the bridge like something physical. Every Krell on duty went rigid. Energy spike. Bran's voice cracked upward, losing all professional modulation. Energy spike on the hospital ship. So, the readings are off every scale I have. The power surge is massive, and it is building, and it is not stopping. Vexus had already spun toward the viewport, and what he saw there silenced every remaining thought in his mind. The hospital ship was changing. Along the entire length of that pristine white hull, sections were moving. Panels that had appeared to be simple hull plating, flush-mounted, seamless, architecturally invisible, was sliding apart and retracting into recessed channels with mechanical precision that spoke not of hasty improvisation, but of engineering that had been planned, tested, and refined over years. Behind those panels, in chambers that had been perfectly invisible until this moment, things were emerging. Large things, complex things, things that glowed with charging power signatures and moved with a deliberate certainty of purpose-built systems coming fully online for exactly the situation they had been designed to address. "Sir," Bren said, his voice barely a whisper now, "I'm reading weapon systems. Multiple weapon systems. Point defense cannons. I count at least 40 separate emplacements. Missile batteries. Energy projectors. And..." He stopped. His claws went still. "And something in the central dorsal section. So, the power draw from that one system alone is comparable to a planetary defense platform." Vexus' hearing ridges, which Vexus had never once seen lie flat in 6 years of shared service, were pressed completely against the skull. "Sir, we are being scanned. Active targeting solutions are being calculated. Multiple target locks beginning to acquire." "That is impossible," Vexus said. The words came out at him automatically, from the part of his mind that was still operating on the assumptions he had carried into this engagement before the universe had decided to revise them. "That is a hospital ship. They cannot arm hospital ships. It violates their own regulations." Someone forgot to mention that to them, Krell said from the weapons station, and there was nothing in his voice now, no caution, no deference, no carefully navigated professional restraint. Just a flat, exhausted tone of a man watching a disaster he had tried to prevent arrive exactly on schedule. "Commander, I am looking at enough firepower to level a small moon, and all of it is pointing at us." The transformation continued. What had appeared to be cargo modules along the vessel's flanks were rotating, revealing armored housings beneath, reinforced, battle-grade plating that bore the markings of military-spec construction. Sensor arrays pivoted from passive observation into active tracking configuration. The entire vessel was metamorphosing with the unhurried mechanical confidence of something that had done this before and expected to do it again. And in the central dorsal section, the area drawing power equivalent to a planetary defense installation, an armored hatch was opening. A massive structure, 100 meters across its longest dimension, split down the middle with a resonant, architectural weight of something built to last centuries. The two halves parted slowly and with absolute mechanical certainty, and from a chamber they revealed, rising like a god of war waking from deliberate, patient sleep, came a weapon that made every Krell on the Talon's bridge go completely silent. "Is that?" Krell began. "A railgun," Bren finished. His voice was barely a whisper. "A capital-class railgun. So, the power reading suggests that weapon can punch through our forward shields like they do not exist, through our armor like it is decorative, through our ship like it is open space." He swallowed. "It is not targeting our weapons, sir. It is targeting our hull." The weapon continued to rise, 50 meters of barrel forged from some dark alloy that seemed to drink the light from the space around it, flanked by capacitor arrays already cycling through their charge sequence. First a soft blue, barely brighter than starlight, then a deeper cobalt, pulsing with building energy, then brighter still, cycling upward through the spectrum of the patient, inexorable momentum of physics doing exactly what physics is designed to do. "Shields," Vexus said, and his voice came from somewhere far below its normal register. "Maximum power to forward shields. Weapons, target that railgun if we can destroy it before it charges." "So," Vexus' voice was completely flat, the calm of someone who has moved past fear into the place on the other side of it. "We are being hailed. Audio only. The message is looping. Shall I play it?" "Yes." The word came out in a croak that Vexus would never have recognized as his own voice under other circumstances. Vexus pressed a control, and a human voice filled the bridge of the Talon of Dominance. She sounded like education and authority. That was the first impression, the measured cadence of someone who had spent years being listened to in rooms where listening was professional requirement, who had cultivated the ability to communicate with precision and without waste. Her tone was professional in the way that a very sharp-edged professional. It served its function with absolute efficiency, and if you failed to understand what that function was, the fault was entirely yours. But underneath the professionalism, underneath the education and the authority and the careful measured cadence, there was something else. Something cold. Something that had been pushed to a specific temperature by specific events and had decided to remain there permanently, like metal that has been forged and will not soften again at ordinary heat. Attention, Krell vessel. This is Captain Helena Voss of the UHMS Nightingale's Mercy. You have fired upon a protected medical vessel in direct violation of interstellar humanitarian law. You have precisely 10 seconds to power down your weapons and prepare to receive a boarding party. Failure to comply will result in your immediate and total destruction. This is your only warning. The clock is running. The message clicked off. Silence on the bridge of the Talon of Dominance. Vexus looked at the railgun on the viewport. Its capacitors had moved through cobalt and past violet and was cycling toward a white that had a quality he had never seen from a weapon system before, the white of energies approaching their theoretical upper limit, the white of physics reaching the edge of what the universe had agreed to permit. He looked at his crew. Bren, white-scale with terror, his claws motionless over a console he had forgotten how to operate. Thixel, hearing ridges flat, already composing the expression of someone who has accepted what is coming. Kell, staring at the viewport with the look of a man whose worst fears have been confirmed and who cannot decide whether he is more frightened or more weary. He looked at the chronometer. 7 seconds. 6. Evasive maneuvers. The words exploded out at him with the raw force of a commander who has just rediscovered his voice through sheer survival instinct. Zortex. Maximum burn. Everything. Now. Helmsman Zortex, who had not spoken a single word since the engagement began, who had sat at his station with the focused stillness of someone watching catastrophe he could not prevent, worked his controls with the desperate precision of a creature fighting against physics itself. The Talon's engines flared. The ship began to turn. But they were too close, their momentum wrong, their positioning the result of an approach made by a commander who had expected to be the apex predator of this encounter, and had positioned accordingly. 4 seconds. 3. The central dorsal hatch of the Nightingale's Mercy was fully open. The rail gun was fully extended. Its barrel was aligned with a precision that spoke of targeting computers so advanced they made the Talon's own systems look like primitive mechanical calculation. The white-hot glow of the capacitors had reached its peak. 2. Vexus opened his mouth to give the order to surrender, to broadcast unconditional capitulation, to do literally anything that might forestall what was about to happen. 1. He was too slow. The railgun fired. There was no dramatic build-up to accompany it. No warning siren. No final moment of suspended tension where physics waited politely for the drama to reach its appropriate emotional peak. The weapon charged, the weapon fired, and the projectile left the barrel at a significant fraction of light speed, and all of that happened in the time it took Commander Vexus to draw a breath. What he saw on the viewport was a line, a perfectly straight line of distorted space, not a beam of energy, not a bolt of plasma, not any of the glowing dramatic weapons discharges he had spent his career both deploying and observing, just a line where the fabric of normal space had been briefly interrupted by something moving through it too fast for the surrounding universe to properly process. What he heard was nothing, because the relevant events had already occurred before sound, traveling at a comparatively leisurely pace, had time to report them. What he felt was a Talon of Dominance lurching sideways with a violence that threw him from his command throne entirely. He hit the deck hard enough to crack scales along his left shoulder, tasted something copper-bright in his mouth, and was still in the process of registering these facts when the sound arrived. The deep, structural groan of a ship being violated at its core, followed immediately by every alarm on the bridge screaming simultaneously. Hull breach! Bren's voice had abandoned its professional training entirely and was communicating in pure, stripped-down survival information. Decks 4 through 7, complete decompression. Emergency bulkheads engaging. Casualty reports incoming. Sir, we have lost. A pause that lasted approximately 1 second and felt approximately 10 times longer. Sir, we have lost over 200 crew members. The projectile, a solid slug of tungsten carbide alloy weighing approximately 2 tons, accelerated to a fraction of light speed, owing nothing to explosives or energy fields, operating purely on the ruthless mathematics of kinetic physics, had entered the Talon's hull just off of the bridge section. It had passed through the crew quarters, through secondary weapons control, through the portside engine room, through 3 separate corridors that had, moments before the shot, been full of personnel moving to battle stations. It had not stopped. It had not fragmented. It had not slowed in any meaningful way. It had punched a perfectly circular hole through the talon of dominance, through multiple decks of military-grade armor, through the machinery and infrastructure of a warship built to survive punishment that would destroy lesser vessels, and had continued out the other side into space, where it was now presumably traveling towards some distant star system to become someone else's problem several centuries from now. The crew members in its path had not been killed. That word implied a process, a moment of transition, something the physiology has time to register. They had been erased. 212 Krell warriors, turned in a fraction of a microsecond into the component atoms from which they had been assembled, scattered across a volume of space too large to mourn in any specific direction. Vexus pulled himself upright, blood from a laceration on his temple smearing across the scales of his cheek. The bridge was chaos, damaged control klaxons layering over each other, the hiss of emergency sealant systems engaging, the desperate voices of officers trying to coordinate responses to a situation that their training had covered in theory, but that no training could fully prepare you for when it was actually happening. "Return fire," he said. His voice was steady. Somewhere in the professional core of him, the part that 32 years of military service had built and reinforced until it was nearly structural, the response of being fired upon was to fire back. All weapons. Full broadside. Target that ship. Krell worked his controls with a mechanical execution of duty in the absence of any better option. The Talon's plasma cannon spoke, dozens of bolts screaming toward the Nightingale's mercy in a broadside that should, by any reasonable calculation, have overwhelmed any defensive system ever installed on a vessel that size. The Nightingale's Mercy's point defense systems, 40 separate emplacements that had been invisible 20 minutes ago, engaged without hesitation. Streams of hypersonic kinetic interceptors met every plasma bolt before it could cover a third of the distance to the hospital ship. The void between the two vessels lit up with brief, spectacular detonations. Not a single bolt reached the white hull. No effect, so. Krell's report was delivered with the flat effect of a creature operating beyond its available emotional range. Their point defense is too fast and too accurate. We cannot land a hit. Missiles. The word came from Vexus with a quality that was less a command than a reflex. Everything. All 60. The Talon's missile bays opened, and a swarm of self-guided warheads screamed outward. 60 missiles, each individually capable of gutting a frigate, coordinated to converge on the target from multiple angles simultaneously. 60 separate problems for a defensive system to solve, all arriving within the same narrow window of time. The Nightingale's Mercy solved all 60 of them in 8 seconds. Tight beam lasers emerged from ports that had not been visible moment before. Precision instruments, the kind used for surgical work rather than brute force application. They swept through the incoming missiles with the calm efficiency of a procedure being performed by someone who has done it many times and does not find it particularly stressful. One by one, then in clusters, the missiles became expanding clouds of metal and unfulfilled purpose. The last 3 died simultaneously. Not one reached the white hull. Not one left so much as a scorch mark. The railgun fired a second time. This shot took the Talon's starboard engine assembly, a direct impact on the fusion containment housing, which meant that the reactor powering the engine experienced what the technical manuals described as containment failure, and what everyone aboard the Talon in the relevant moment experienced as a small sun briefly coming into existence inside the engineering section. The explosion removed a third of the ship's thrust capacity, vaporized 200 more crew members, and sent the vessel into a violent spin that Zortex, claws blurring over his controls, could compensate for only partially. Primary maneuvering offline, Bren reported. His voice had gone to the flat calm of someone who has passed through terror into a place beyond it. Hull integrity at 38%. Life support failing on decks 8 through 12. Casualty count is over 500 and still updating. 500, out of a crew of 2,000. In less than 90 seconds of combat. Surrender. The word came from Vexus with a quality he had never expected to hear in his own voice. Not defeat, exactly, but the recognition that the assumptions under which he had made his decisions were not the assumptions that the universe was currently operating under. Open all channels. Broadcast unconditional surrender. Now. Vexus's claws moved across a console with desperate urgency. Channel open, sir. All frequencies. This is Commander Vexus of the Krell Dominion warship Talon of Dominance. He stood at what he hoped was something approaching the posture of dignity, though he was bleeding from his temple, and his uniform bore evidence of having spent time on the floor of a ship currently spinning through space. We surrender. Unconditionally. Our weapons are being powered down. We are not a threat. Please, ceasefire. Silence fell on the bridge. Even the klaxon seemed to lose conviction. The only sounds were the hiss of emergency atmosphere systems and, from the helmsman's station, the barely audible sound of Zortex weeping with the quiet practicality of someone who considers it important to process emotions efficiently so they do not interfere with the work of keeping what remains of the ship from breaking apart entirely. Then Captain Helena Voss's voice returned, and it was colder than before. Not the professional cold of the warning message. This was something more personal, the cold of someone who has seen specific things and has decided, on the basis of those things, exactly how she feels about the species responsible for them. Surrender acknowledged, Commander Vexus. I am going to honor that surrender, because that is what the conventions require, and I follow the conventions. But before we proceed to the formal terms, I believe we owe each other a conversation. The railgun began charging again. Its capacitors cycled upward through the spectrum with the same patient, inexorable inevitability. You cannot do that, Vexus said, and even he could hear how inadequate the words were. We have surrendered. You are required to honor. I will honor your surrender, Commander. A pause, precisely long enough to make its point. I will also ensure that you leave this encounter with an education you will share with your high command. Consider what follows part of that education. The Geneva Conventions, she continued, and the words came out of her like something that had been waiting for an appropriate moment. They are a series of treaties, among the oldest continuous legal agreements in human history, governing the conduct of armed conflict. They establish protections for prisoners of war, for civilian populations, for medical personnel, for the wounded, and yes, Commander, specifically, unambiguously, without exception, for hospital ships. A pause. You knew this. Your young officer cited it to you before you opened fire. You chose to disregard it. You are armed, Vexus said. He was aware of how weak this sounded, but it was the only argument available to him. A hospital ship carrying a capital-class railgun is not operating within the spirit of. Let me explain Article 35 of the Second Geneva Convention as adapted for interstellar warfare, since your legal education appears to have some gaps. The temperature in her voice dropped another degree. Hospital ships are protected from attack under any circumstances. They are not valid military targets. This is not negotiable. However, and this is a part your education miss, Commander, they are permitted to carry defensive armament sufficient to ensure the survival of attack by parties who have decided to ignore the part about them not being valid military targets. On the Talon's battered bridge, Bren looked up from his console with something that might, in different circumstances, have been an academic question. But that railgun is not defensive. That is a ship killer. That is something you install when you intend. I can hear you, Voss said, and there was a quality to the words that suggested she found the interruption less offensive than expected. And your officer is right to question it. So let me tell you why it exists. The bridge of the Talon went completely still. 3 years ago, Voss continued, and the cold in her voice had acquired something new, something that sat underneath the professional control like bedrock beneath ice, immovable and ancient. A Krell raiding party attacked a human hospital ship called the Florence's Promise. It was operating under full medical convention protections in the aftermath of the Battle of Kepler Station. It was carrying 4,000 wounded personnel, human, Krell, Vraxian, and others, receiving equal care regardless of species or allegiance, as the convention requirements. It was unarmed. It relied entirely on established interstellar law for its protection. Another pause. This one lasted long enough that Vexus found himself counting the seconds unconsciously. The raiding party boarded the vessel. They executed the entire medical staff, 143 doctors, nurses, and medical technicians. Then they opened the Florence's hull to space. Her voice did not waver. It simply continued, the way a blade continues through what it has been directed to pass through. They killed 4,000 patients. Every single one. They released a statement afterward claiming the vessel had been a legitimate military target because it had been treating Krell wounded alongside human wounded, that the act of providing equal medical care constituted collaboration that voided the ship's protected status. Vexus knew about this. He remembered it. High Command had issued a statement of pride. There had been a small ceremony. The officer who led the boarding action had been promoted. The memory sat in him now like a stone dropped into still water, sinking with a weight that had no bottom. After the Florence's promise, Voss said, humanity had a decision to make. We could stop operating hospital ships in contested space. We could withdraw our medical personnel from the forward areas and let the wounded of all species manage without us. We chose not to do that, because we believe the conventions are right, and because the alternative is a galaxy where no one provides medical care to anyone in a conflict zone, and that is a galaxy we refuse to help build. The railgun capacitors maintained their glow, charged, patient, waiting. But we also made another decision. We decided that the Florence's promise would be the last time. We armed our hospital ships. We armed them seriously. We distributed the specifications to every spacefaring government through formal diplomatic channels, so that no one could ever claim ignorance of what they were choosing to engage. We sent warnings, Commander, years of warnings. We followed every procedure. Her voice settled into something almost quiet. And then we waited to see whether the warnings would be sufficient. They were not sufficient, Vexus said, and he was surprised to hear in his own voice something he would spend a long time thinking about before he could properly name it. It was not quite shame. Krell physiology processed that emotion differently, but it was adjacent to it and closer to it than anything he had felt before. No, Voss agreed. They were not, but you will be. New contact appeared on the Talon's battered, half-functional sensor array. Bren stared at the readings with the hollow eyes of someone who has already reached their maximum capacity for bad news and is watching the universe exceed it anyway. So, those are Krell transponder signatures. It is the rest of the attack squadron. They must have detected the weapons fire. 6 Krell warships dropped out of faster-than-light transit in precise tactical formation, the textbook arrival pattern for a strike group responding to a flagship under fire. Their weapons were already charged. Their targeting systems were already active. They had arrived. Vexus understood with a sinking clarity that felt physical at exactly the wrong moment with exactly the wrong understanding of the situation. Tell them to withdraw, Vexus said. Immediately. All channels. Maximum power. Tell them to retreat from this sector right now. Vexus broadcast the order with desperate urgency, and for a moment, a single, fragile, insufficient moment, it seemed possible that it might wake. Then the response came back from Strike Group 7's commander, a younger officer named Craxus, whose voice carried the rich, confident timbre of someone who has just arrived at the scene of disaster and has entirely misread its nature. Talon of Dominance, this is Strike Group 7. We see the damage you have taken. We are moving to engage the human vessel and avenge the flagship. Hold your position. Reinforcements have arrived. No, Vexus said quietly, to no one in particular, to the universe that had assembled this specific collection of events. No, no, no. He tried. He broadcast on every available frequency. He ordered Vexus to repeat the withdrawal command, to override Craxus's authority, to transmit sensor recordings of what had just occurred. He attempted to reach Craxus personally on the squadron commander's private channel, to describe in plain terms exactly what was waiting for them, to communicate the magnitude of what they were flying toward. Craxus had already begun his attack run. I am going to give your colleagues the same warning I gave you, Voss said, and now she sounded almost tired. Not the tiredness of someone weakened, but the tiredness of someone who has done this before, who knows exactly what is about to happen, and who has long since made peace with the necessity of it while retaining the capacity to regret it. I hope they make a better choice than you did. The Nightingale's Mercy rotated to face the incoming strike group with a measured, unhurried movement of a vessel that is not worried about its survival, its full weapons complement oriented toward the new arrivals. The rail gun track left, locking onto the lead element of Craxus's formation. Attention Krell Strike Group 7. This is Captain Helena Voss of the UHMS Nightingale's Mercy. You are approaching a protected medical vessel engaged in lawful defensive action against an aggressor. If you enter weapons range, you will be classified as hostile combatants and engaged with lethal force. This is the only warning you will receive. Craxus's response was to open fire. It was the last meaningful decision he ever made. The Nightingale's mercy erupted. The railgun fired, then fired again, each shot aimed with computer-guided precision that made the word accuracy seem insufficient. Missiles launched in coordinated swarms that overwhelmed point defenses through sheer numbers and approach vectors. Energy projectors carved through armor with the focus, purposeful efficiency of a surgeon rather than the blunt devastation of a soldier. And through it all, Captain Voss's voice remained calm. Professional. She narrated the destruction the way a teacher narrates a lesson that has been prepared and delivered many times, to students who have shown up too late to change the outcome. Target 1. Mobility kill achieved. Engine assembly destroyed. Vessel drifting. The railgun fired. The lead Krell warship lost a propulsion section in a detonation visible from the Talon's damaged viewport. Target 2. Coordinating missile salvo for reactor strike. 6 missiles launched from hidden bays, threading through the formation with targeting precision that was uncomfortable to observe. Target 2. Catastrophic reactor failure. The second warship came apart from the inside. Its breach lit up the sector for a fraction of a second that felt much longer. Target 3. Structural failure midships. A beam of coherent energy traced a line across the third ship's dorsal section. Target 4. Magazine detonation initiated. They are not targeting the weapons, Bren said, very quietly, from the sensor station. His voice had taken on the quality of someone making an observation that is changing them as they make it. They are targeting propulsion, reactors, structural load-bearing points. They are not trying to destroy them quickly. They are trying to. He stopped. They are trying to preserve crew, Kell said. He sounded as though the observation cost him something. Even now, even during this, they are trying to give them a chance to surrender. Not all of the ships survived the attempt to be spared, because some of them made choices that left the Nightingale's mercy no alternatives. The fifth warship, rather than accepting its disabled state, attempted to ram. It was intercepted by missile bearers that were proportionate, complete, and entirely without options, and it did not reach its target. 8 minutes after Strike Group 7 arrived, it was over. 6 Krell warships disabled or destroyed, scattered across the sector in various states of catastrophic damage. The Nightingale's mercy floated among the wreckage with its weapons still tracking, its hull still pristine white, its red crosses still visible from distances that required no magnification. This concludes the demonstration portion of your education, Commander Vexus, Voss said. I trust the material was clear. The cruelest part, the part that Vexus would spend the next 20 years thinking about during long, quiet shifts at Outpost 4-7, was that they did not finish the job. The Nightingale's mercy could have destroyed the Talon of Dominance. There was no tactical argument against it. The Talon was disabled, its weapons offline, its propulsion reduced to a fraction of its design capacity, its crew losses in the hundreds and climbing. The Nightingale's mercy had the firepower, the positioning, and by any reasonable interpretation of defensive action, the legal and moral justification. Captain Helena Voss chose not to. Instead, transport shuttles were deployed from the hospital ship. Human medical personnel, doctors and nurses wearing uniforms marked with those same red crosses that Vexus had laughed at less than 2 hours ago, boarded the Talon of Dominance through its damaged airlocks and moved through the wreckage of the ship with the purposeful, unhurried efficiency of professionals doing the thing they had trained to do. They treated the wounded. All of them. Krell warriors who had been manning weapon stations when those stations were destroyed, who had been alive in purposeful moment before and were now in various states of catastrophic physical damage. The human medical teams found them, stabilized them, treated them, without asking a single question about why the Krell vessel had attacked them in the first place, without making any of the dying wait until questions of guilt or accountability had been sorted out, without doing anything other than the thing the red crosses on their uniforms had always promised they would do. A human medic with a name tag reading Chen, Captain set Vexus's fractured arm with practiced efficiency and spoke to him in passable Krell, not perfectly pronounced, but functional, learned, the kind of language acquisition that requires effort and respect for the culture behind it. You are fortunate, Commander, Chen said, working with the focused attention of someone for whom the professional and the personal have achieved a working agreement. Captain Voss considered leaving your vessel to drift. She decided it would violate the spirit of the conventions, that medical personnel treat patients regardless of the circumstances that produce their injuries. He applied a regenerative compound to the laceration on Vexus's temple with the same careful attention he might have given any patient. Do not mistake that decision for weakness. I have made enough of that mistake for one day, Vexus said, and he meant it with a totality he had rarely felt about anything. The captain is letting you live so you can go home and explain what happens when you attack a human hospital ship. Chen gathered his equipment with the brisk economy of movement of someone who has other patients waiting. Consider yourself a living warning. Commander, do not waste the opportunity. 3 days later, Vexus stood before the Krell High Command Council in the formal hearing chamber of Krell Prime's military administrative complex. His arm was in a cast fabricated by human medical technology. His ship had been coaxed back to Krell space with assistance from human engineers, its jury-rigged engines a monument to the particular humiliation of being helped home by the people you attacked. His uniform was fresh and correct and entirely insufficient in the face of what he was about to report. High Counselor Threx, ancient, politically calculating, a creature who had navigated the complexities of Krell power for longer than Vexus had been alive, listened to the full account without interrupting. The other council members shifted in their seats. Several of them, Vexus noted, had the particular stillness of beings who already know the information being delivered and are watching to see whether the person delivering it understands its implications. Let me make certain I have understood this correctly, Threx said when Vexus had finished. The old counselor's voice carried no anger. Anger would have been easier. What it carried instead was the weight of someone revising a fundamental assumption that their entire strategic framework had been built upon. You attacked a clearly marked hospital ship. This hospital ship destroyed your entire strike group, and you are alive today because the humans chose to show mercy. Yes, High Counselor. The same humans we have publicly and consistently characterized as soft, as sentimental, as a species whose commitment to their regulations represents a strategic vulnerability we have explicitly planned to exploit. Yes, High Counselor. The council chamber was very quiet. Threx leaned back in his seat, and Vexus watched the old counselor think. Not the performative thinking of someone preparing a response for an audience, but the genuine, private, architectural kind of thinking that happens when someone discovers a foundation needs reconstruction. This changes things, Threx said finally, not to the council, not to the room, to himself, with a particular quality of someone accepting an unwelcome truth because the alternative is to remain wrong indefinitely. We have been reading their adherence to these conventions as a limitation, a self-imposed constraint that made them predictable and exploitable. He looked at the council members, one by one, with the eyes of someone distributing a shared responsibility. We were wrong. Their conventions are not their weakness. They are language, a set of promises, about what they will do, about what they will not do, about where the lines are and what happens when someone crosses them. And when someone crosses those lines, they enforce them, not reluctantly, not as a last resort, with the full weight of everything they are capable of. The formal orders issued that afternoon were distributed to every Krell military vessel within 12 hours. All ships were to maintain a minimum distance of 10,000 kilometers from any vessel displaying human medical markings. Any commander who violated this order would be court-martialed. The court-martial was expected to conclude with an execution. Vexus was stripped of his command and reassigned to Outpost 47, a monitoring station at the edge of Krell space, a posting the military bureaucracy reserved for officers whose careers had concluded one way or another. He accepted the posting without argument. He had, after all, destroyed an entire strike group and received medical care from people he had attacked. The monitoring station seemed proportionate. The story spread the way only certain stories spread. Stories that contain, at their center, something that changes how the listener understands the world they live in. Within a week, every major spacefaring government had received full accounts of the engagement through intelligence channels, diplomatic transmissions, and the kind of informal information sharing that happens when something genuinely remarkable occurs in contested space. Within a month, it had acquired the quality of legend. The Vraxian Empire issued updated military protocols. The Torvan Confederacy convened a strategic review board that produced, among other recommendations, new rules of engagement specifically addressing human hospital ships. Even the notoriously aggressive Thar clans, creatures whose military philosophy had always prioritized offensive action above all other considerations, quietly began giving human medical vessels a respectful berth that their treaties had always technically required but had never before actually been honored. A phrase entered galactic military vocabulary, the Nightingale Protocol. It meant, in its original precise formulation, do not attack medical vessels, do not threaten non-combatants, do not mistake humanity's commitment to the rules of war for an inability to wage it. But in practice, in the way it was actually used in briefing rooms and command councils and tactical planning sessions across a dozen civilizations, it meant something simpler and more fundamental. There are lines, and some lines carry consequences that will survive your decision to cross them, and the humans will enforce those consequences with a thoroughness that you will not be able to argue your way out of afterward. The Florence's Promise was rebuilt and recommissioned. It returned to contested space under its original name, carrying its original purpose, medical care for anyone who needed it, without regard for species or allegiance or which side of any given conflict they happened to occupy. It was larger than its predecessor, better equipped, and it carried, in its central dorsal section, a weapon that no one who knew its history ever needed to be told the purpose of. 20 cycles after the engagement, Vexus sat in the observation deck of Outpost 47 and watched the Florence's Promise pass through his sector. He was old now in the way that time makes old. Joints that ache with injuries human medicine had healed but never fully erased, scales that had lost the sharp sheen of youth, 4 eyes that had seen enough to know the difference between what they were looking at and what they had once thought they were looking at. He had spent 2 decades at this monitoring station, logging ship positions, tracking traffic patterns, making absolutely certain that no Krell vessel accidentally wandered too close to any human medical ship that passed through his area of responsibility. He had become, without intending to or even fully noticing the transition, the person who protected human hospital ships from Krell interference. The irony of this was not lost on him. He had thought about it often enough that it had moved through irony and out the other side into something more like a permanent condition of his existence, a fact about himself that he carried the way he carried the arm that human medicine had set and that had healed slightly wrong, a constant small reminder of a specific day and a specific choice. A young officer appeared beside him, fresh from the academy, scales still pale with inexperience, eyes carrying the particular bright confidence of someone who has not yet had their framework revised by reality. He looked at the Florence's Promise the way Vexus had once looked at the Nightingale's Mercy, as a target with a vulnerability profile, and a set of tactical considerations to be evaluated. "So," the young officer said, "that is a human medical vessel. Should we not at least conduct a scan? Standard practice for unidentified vessels." "It is not unidentified," Vexus said. He did not look away from the viewport. "It is identified, precisely and completely. The red crosses identify it. The white hull identifies it. Everything about that vessel is designed to identify it, clearly and unambiguously, as a thing that you do not engage with, do not approach, and do not allow yourself to think aggressive thoughts about while it is within sensor range." "But, sir, regulations state." "I know what the regulations state. I helped inform them." He was quiet for a moment. "Sit down." The young officer sat today. "You see that ship," Vexus said, and his voice had taken on a quality that the officer would remember for the rest of his career, not commanding, exactly, but fundamental. The tone of something important being transferred from one generation to the next, something that has been owned at a cost the speaker has never finished paying. That beautiful, peaceful-looking ship with its friendly markings and its promise of healing. I want you to understand exactly what you are looking at. You are looking at the most carefully considered expression of what humans fundamentally are." He paused, watching the white vessel move through the darkness with its characteristic unhurried grace. They built that ship because they believe, genuinely, institutionally, with the full weight of their civilization behind it, that the wounded deserve care regardless of who wounded them, and regardless of what flag they were fighting under when it happened. That belief is not naive. Naive beliefs do not survive contact with the reality of what war actually is, what it actually does, what it actually costs the people in the middle of it. That belief has survived. It has survived because they made it survive, because they decided it was worth protecting with everything they had. "But, sir, I am not finished." "Not harshly, simply a fact. The humans have a medical oath. Their physicians swear, at the beginning of their careers, to do no harm. That oath is real. They honor it. They will treat you or any wounded creature from any species, without question and without condition, if you need treatment. They will risk their lives to preserve yours. They will show mercy in circumstances where mercy is the hardest possible thing to show. He turned to look at the young officer directly, meeting his eyes with all four of his own. I know this to be true because human doctors treated my crew after I attacked their hospital ship. I know it in my arm, which aches when the station's temperature drops, set by human hands after I tried to destroy the vessel those hands served on. The Florence's promise was growing smaller in the viewport, moving toward the edge of sensor range. But the oath says do no harm, officer. It does not say accept all harm done unto you. It does not say let your healers be killed. It does not say let your wounded be spaced. And when you harm their healers, when you attack their hospitals, when you threaten the people who have dedicated their lives to pulling others back from the edge of death, they will respond. Not out of vengeance, not out of anger, though I have heard Captain Voss sound angry, and I will tell you it is among the more unsettling experiences available to a living creature. They will respond because they have made a promise to every wounded person in every forward operating area in every contested sector in the galaxy that help is available, and that the people providing that help will not be killed for providing it. He stood, joint protesting in their familiar way. And they keep their promises, officer, every one of them. The promises to heal and the promises to defend. The promises of mercy and the promises of consequences. They keep all of them, with equal seriousness, and they do not apologize for the apparent contradiction because they do not believe it is a contradiction. He walked toward the inner station, pausing once at the doorway with his back to the viewport and the diminishing light of a hospital ship's engines. Never touch the hospital ships. Not ever. Not under any provocation. Not under any orders. Not under any calculation of tactical advantage that seemed compelling in the moment. That is not cowardice. That is the only correct reading of the situation available to any creature capable of reading the situation correctly. His voice dropped slightly. It took me the destruction of 7 warships and the deaths of thousands of Krell warriors to understand it. You had the considerable luxury of learning it from me instead. He walked away, leaving the young officer alone with the viewport and the empty space where the Florence's promise had been, space still faintly crossed by the distant light of its passage, the ghost of a ship that healed the wounded and defended the healers and asked nothing in return except to be left in peace to do its work. Outside, in the dark between stars, the Nightingale's mercy continued its rounds, white and bright and absolutely, terrifyingly certain. Its doctors moved through their wards with the quiet purpose of people who have chosen the hardest possible version of their calling, and have chosen it with open eyes. Its red crosses shone against the black, and its railgun waited, as it always waited, charged and ready and patient, for anyone who had not yet learned the difference between mercy and weakness, between protection and pacifism, between a red cross and an invitation. Not many made that mistake twice. Vexus had made it once, and survived only because the humans who had every right to destroy him had chosen, instead, to heal him. He spent the rest of his life trying to be worth that choice. A hybrid Shadow's original story. Commander Vexus of the Krell Dominion was, by any objective measure, a creature who had never known doubt. 32 years of military service had carved him into something sharp and predatory, a weapon in uniform, all gleaming eyes and calculated cruelty. He had commanded warships through 3 different galactic conflicts. He had broken siege lines that lesser officers thought impenetrable. He had earned enough battle citations to wallpaper his private quarters, and he had done so through a simple, unflinching philosophy. The universe belonged to those who were willing to take it. So when the long-range sensors of the Talon of Dominance lit up with the most exquisite target he had ever encountered in 3 decades of service, Commander Vexus did not hesitate. He leaned back in his command throne, a massive structure of polished black alloy custom-fitted to his 8-foot frame, and allowed himself the rare luxury of pure, unfiltered delight. All 4 of his eyes gleamed with predatory satisfaction. His mandibles clicked softly together, the Krell equivalent of a quiet laugh shared only with oneself. This was going to be extraordinary. He could feel it in the marrow of his hollow bones. "Tactical Officer Bren," he said, his voice carrying across the hushed bridge with easy authority. "Tell me what I am looking at." He already knew, of course. The readings were perfectly clear, but there was a particular pleasure in hearing the words spoken aloud, in watching another creature process and name the gift that fortune had deposited directly in his lap. Bren, a younger Krell with barely 3 cycles of military service and scales that still held a pale greenish hue of inexperience, tapped at his console with slightly trembling claws. "Sir," he said carefully, "long-range sensors have detected a human vessel. Classification appears to be non-military. Coordinates locked at grid 7-9 Alpha. It is broadcasting standard identification signals without any attempt at concealment." "Non-military," Vexus repeated, savoring each syllable like the finest Krell spirit. His mandibles clicked again, louder this time, a sound that rippled uneasily through the bridge crew even as some of the more senior officers managed polite, obligatory chuckles. "Show me visual, Mr. Bren. Let me see this gift with my own eyes." The main viewport shimmered and resolved, and there it hung in the infinite black, the most absurdly, magnificently, almost offensively obvious target Vexus had encountered in his entire career. The vessel was enormous. That was the first thing. Easily twice the tonnage of the Talon of Dominance, which was itself no patrol skiff. It was a Krell heavy cruiser, bristling with weaponry and armor to withstand planetary bombardment. The human vessel dwarfed the way a leviathan dwarfs a river fish. Its hull plates were broad and sweeping, designed for space efficiency rather than combat profile, curved in ways that suggested enormous internal volume. Space for equipment, for personnel, for the 10,000 quiet necessities of sustained operations far from any support infrastructure. But the size was not what made Commander Vexus grip the armrest of the command throne with barely restrained glee. It was the color. The ship was white. Not the dull gray-white of unpainted hull plating, not the dingy cream of aged infrastructure, but white, pure, pristine, almost luminescent white, the kind of white that existed as a philosophical statement as much as a visual property. It gleamed against the darkness of space with the serene confidence of a thing that believed absolutely in its own inviolability. And painted across that immaculate hull, in enormous red markings that were visible from distances that would have required magnification for any other symbol, were crosses, medical crosses, the universal symbol, recognized across every spacefaring civilization in the known galaxy, of healing, mercy, and, as Vexus's delighted mind categorized it, complete and utter defenselessness. "By the 7 moons of Krell Prime," Vexus whispered to himself, and then, unable to contain it any longer, broke into full-throated laughter, the sharp, clicking, rattling sound of a Krell in genuine amusement, which sounded to human ears rather like a formal dining room being disassembled by machinery. Several bridge crew members joined in. Some of it was genuine, some of it was politic, and some of it, from the more experienced officers, carried a slightly different quality, something hollower and less certain, like laughter deployed to fill a silence that felt, for reasons they could not quite articulate, as though it perhaps should not be filled. Bren cleared his throat with the cautious precision of someone navigating unfamiliar terrain. "So, according to human maritime tradition, which their interstellar treaty frameworks extend to spaceborne vessels, hospital ships are protected under an agreement called the Geneva Convention. Firing upon medical vessels is formally classified as a war crime under the terms of—" "A war crime," Vexus interrupted, dabbing at the moisture that genuine amusement had forced from his primary eyes. He held up one long-clawed hand, silencing the young officer with lazy magnanimity. "Bren, my earnest, well-studied, thoroughly naive officer, let me ask you a question. Cast your senses wide. Tell me, do you see any human warships in this sector? Any fleet elements, any patrol craft, any recording devices, any witnesses of any description?" Bren's scales flushed a darker shade, the Krell equivalent of a blush, though the emotion driving it was more complicated than embarrassment. "No, sir. Sensors show we are entirely alone in this sector." "Exactly." Vexus brought his fist down on the armrest with a crack that echoed across the bridge. "And beyond that, everyone in this galaxy knows what humans are. They are soft, Bren, sentimental. They build hospitals in contested space because they genuinely believe that their little pieces of paper, their conventions, their treaties, their charmingly optimistic regulations, will protect them from the realities of the universe." He stood, stretching to his full height, filling the command space with the physical certainty of a creature who had never once been told he was wronged by anything larger than himself. They probably filled that magnificent medical barge with their wounded from the skirmish at Proxima Station, helpless little mammals floating through the dark, trusting in the geared will of species they have not yet properly met. He turned toward the weapons station with the deliberate, unhurried movement of someone who has already won, and is simply completing the formality of the victory. Weapons Officer Krell, charge forward plasma banks. We are going to send these humans a very educational message about the practical value of their treaties.